The stove ticked in the silence after the man closed the ledger. Flour dust drifted across the table where his fingers had pressed the page flat. A girl sat on a stool near the iron door, a turnip half peeled in her lap, watching the way children watch when they know the conversation is about them but cannot yet decode the words. The woman across the table had not moved. Her hands were still. Her face was still. Only the cloth at her sleeve shifted, dusted white where she had been working before he arrived. He folded a piece of paper and slid it into his vest. "A widow can sign land away same as any man can," he said. The door swung shut behind him. The girl looked at her mother. The turnip peel curled to the floor. In the last week of October, 1887, Marit Brecka washed the mud from her husband's boots, wrapped them in sacking, and set them under the bed. Eli asked whether her father would need them when spring came. Marit said nothing. She folded the sacking tighter and pushed the boots against the wall where they would not be stepped on in the dark. John Brecka had cut his hand on a broken plow clevis 9 days before harvest. The wound turned red, then black along the knuckle. Blood poisoning moved through his arm like ink through water. He died on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the first frost had killed the squash vines he had planted along the south wall of the cabin. Marit buried him on the quarter section because the church cemetery was 11 miles away, and she could not leave Eli alone with the body while she drove. She was 34 years old, Norwegian-born, from a tenant farm near Telemark. She had come to Dakota Territory with John 3 years earlier because the Homestead Act said any adult citizen or any widow or any woman who had been deserted could claim 160 acres by living on the land and improving it. John had filed. John had built. John had plowed the first cuts. And now John was in the ground beside the northwest corner post, and the land was Marit's problem. The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet. 2 walls were sod, cut blocks of prairie grass and root, stacked like dark bricks. The other 2 walls were rough cottonwood boards chinked with river clay that cracked in dry wind and softened in rain. The roof was sawed over poles, low enough that Marit could press her palm flat against it without straightening her arm. One iron stove sat near the center, vented through a pipe that angled twice before reaching the roof. Newspaper lined the inside walls where the boards showed gaps. The floor was packed earth. She had 1 daughter, one aging draft mare named Brindle, sway-backed and patient, $13.40 in a tin behind the flour bin. 1 3/4 cords of mixed cottonwood and willow, cut green and stacked against the east wall where John had left them. A half sack of flour, 6 pounds of salt pork, 11 jars of chokecherry and turnip preserves, a broken singletree, a rusted iron slip scraper with a cracked handle, a plow with a clevis that had already killed her husband. Coal was 16 miles away at the depot. The freighter charged $2 per hundredweight delivered. She could not afford a single load. Winter in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, did not negotiate. It arrived in November and did not leave until April. The temperature could fall 40 degrees in a single night. Ground blizzards lifted old snow and ran it sideways across the prairie until a person could not see a fence post 10 feet away. The wind did not blow around obstacles. It went through them. It found every gap in every wall, every crack under every sill, every seam where sod met board. It turned houses into sieves, and Marit Brecka had less than 2 cords of soft green wood to burn from November through March. The first person to tell her it was impossible was Alpheus Rowe. Rowe was 58, the township road overseer, a former stage driver who had survived 2 decades of Plains winters by knowing exactly how much punishment a structure could absorb and how much fuel it took to keep the people inside it breathing. He came to Marit's quarter section in the first week of November because the township road crossed her land and he needed to check the drainage grade before freeze-up. He did not come to mock her. That made him worse. Roe walked the cabin slowly. He pressed his thumb against the clay chinking on the north wall and watched it crumble onto his boot. He opened the stove door, looked at the firebox, closed it without speaking. He measured the sod walls with his eyes, tapped the cottonwood boards with his knuckle, and stood for a long moment looking at the wood pile. Then he turned to Marit and spoke as if reading a verdict. "You have a stove fit for a claim shanty, not a Dakota winter," Roe said. "You have boards where sod should be. That north wall will let wind through, like it is not there by January. You have less than 2 cords." He paused. "A woman alone needs 6, and that is if God lends her mercy." Marit said she would cut more willow from the slough 2 miles south. Roe shook his head. "Green willow steams before it burns. You will clog that pipe in a week." He reached into the stove and scraped his fingernail along the inside of the elbow joint. A crust of black creosote came away under his nail, thick as candle wax. "You see this? Green wood makes this. This catches fire inside the pipe. Then you have a chimney fire in January and no way to put it out because your water pail is frozen solid." He was not cruel. He was precise. That was the problem. Every number he gave was real. Every objection was earned. He had seen women widowed on claims before, and he had seen what happened when they stayed past the point where staying made sense. "Mrs. Brecka," Rose said, "I have seen sod houses with 4-foot walls and 8 cords stacked tight survive a hard winter. I have seen frame houses with proper shelter belts make it through. What I have never seen is a woman with a child, a lame mare, and 2 cords of green cottonwood survive from November to April in a cabin with newspaper walls." Marit looked at the woodpile. 1 3/4 cords. She had counted it that morning, measuring each stick against the length of her forearm. John had cut it in September before the clevis. It was not seasoned. It was not enough. Roe was not wrong about any of it. "What would you have me do?" Marit asked. "Sell," Roe said, "before the ground freezes." He left before she could answer. His boot prints froze in the mud by noon. Marit did not sleep that night. She fed the stove twice, and twice the heat climbed to the ceiling and vanished while the floor stayed cold enough to make Eli curl into a knot under the blanket. Marit knelt beside the bed and held her hand near the floor. The air moved, not from the door, not from the window, from beneath the sill where the packed earth met the bottom of the north wall. The prairie was breathing into her house. She stuffed rags into the gap. The air kept coming. She packed clay against the base. It crumbled before morning. The problem was not a single crack. The problem was the entire relationship between the house and the ground it sat on. Wind moved across the flat prairie at whatever speed it chose, struck the cabin wall, and curled under the sill like water running beneath a dam. The stove could not win that fight. It was not a matter of fuel, it was a matter of physics. The house was losing heat faster than any stove could replace it. By dawn, Marit had burned 3 armloads of wood. The cabin was not warm. It was merely not lethal. She sat at the table with her hands around a cup of chicory that was already cooling and did the arithmetic that would determine whether her daughter lived or died. 1 3/4 cords. 5 months of winter. 3 armloads a night on a moderate cold night. More on a bad night. Far more during a blizzard, when the wind turned the cabin into a bellows that sucked warmth out through every seam. At this rate, the wood would last 6 weeks. Maybe 7 if she let the fire die during the warmest hours and wrapped Eli in every blanket they owned. 6 weeks out of 20. She could cut more willow. But Roe was right. Green willow burned wet, smoked the pipe, and deposited creosote that could ignite inside the chimney. She could burn hay twists, but hay twists gave weak heat and had to be fed constantly. She could burn dried cow chips if she could find them under the snow. She could burn the furniture. She could burn the cabin itself, one board at a time, and end the winter living in a hole. None of it was enough. The math did not work. It could not work. Not as long as the wind owned the ground beneath her house. Cassian Blunt arrived on the second Tuesday in November. He came in a wagon with a canvas cover, which meant he had been visiting other claims that morning. Blunt was 46, the storekeeper in the settlement 8 miles east, and he held paper on half the homesteaders in the township. He sold seed, flour, nails, kerosene, and credit. The credit was where the profit lived. A farmer who owed Blunt for spring seed and winter supplies either paid after harvest or signed a new note at worse terms. A farmer who could not pay lost the note, and Blunt could buy the failed claim at a fraction of its value. He carried a ledger under his arm when he stepped down from the wagon. His coat smelled of coal smoke and tallow. His boots were wet. He did not knock. He pushed the door open, saw Eli sitting on a stool near the stove peeling a turnip, and removed his hat as if entering a place he already considered his. "Mrs. Brecka," Blunt said, "I have come about the note." The note was for $48. John had signed it the previous spring for seed wheat, a keg of nails, 2 panes of glass, salt pork, and 20 pounds of flour. The terms required repayment after harvest. There had been no harvest because John had died before the wheat was cut, and the wheat had gone to seed in the field. Blunt set the ledger on the table and opened it to the page. He turned it so Marit could see John's signature. He did not need to. She knew the amount. She had known it every day since the burial. $48 due, Blunt said. The terms say after harvest. Harvest is past. I could call the note today. I have $13, Marit said. I know what you have. Blunt closed the ledger. I'm not here to collect $13. I'm here to offer you a choice. You can sell me the claim before winter. I will give you $60 for the quarter section, cancel the note, and pay your fare to Huron, where there is a boarding house that takes women with children. Or you can sign a new note at 8% through spring thaw, and if you cannot pay by April, I take the claim and you leave with nothing. $60 for 160 acres. The claim was worth $300 at minimum, more if the improvements held and the wheat came in next year. Blunt was not offering help. He was offering the mathematics of despair. Take a bad deal now, or take a worse deal later. Marit looked at Eli. The girl had stopped peeling the turnip and was watching Blunt with the focused stillness of a child who understands that something terrible is being discussed in a language she can almost follow. A widow can sign land away same as any man can, Blunt said. He folded the note and slid it into his vest pocket. I will give you until spring thaw. After that, the terms speak for themselves. He put his hat on and left. The door swung shut. The stove ticked. Flour dust settled on the table where the ledger had been. Marit could not leave. She had no relatives within 400 miles. Rail passage to Huron cost more than she had, and Blunt's $60 would vanish into board and keep within 2 months. The claim was the only thing standing between Eli and charity. Under the Homestead Act, Marit could hold the land if she continued living on it and improving it. If she abandoned it, she lost the filing, lost the improvements, and lost the only asset she possessed. The debt would follow her regardless. She was trapped on 160 acres of frozen prairie with a child, a lame horse, $13, and a house that could not keep the wind out. The idea did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as a failure. 3 nights after Blunt's visit, a ground wind came from the northwest. Not a blizzard, not even a proper storm. Just a steady, low current of air that ran across the prairie at knee height, fast enough to push loose snow into ripples and strong enough to find every gap in every wall. Marit woke at 2 in the morning because something was moving. Not the door, not the window curtain, the flour sack. The 10-pound sack of flour hanging from a nail on the north wall was swaying. Air was coming through the floor seam below the sill with enough force to move cloth. She got up. The stove was banked but still warm. She held her hand at waist height. The air was tolerable. She lowered her hand to knee height. Colder. She crouched and held her hand at the level of the packed dirt floor. The air cut across her fingers like creek water. The cabin had 2 temperatures. Warm air near the ceiling where it did nothing. Cold air along the floor where Eli slept, where the food sat, where Marit's boots froze if she left them on the ground overnight. She banked the stove higher. The warm air rose. The cold air stayed. The stove was fighting a war it could not win because it was fighting gravity. Heat goes up. Cold stays down. And the wind kept forcing more cold air under the sill, replacing whatever warmth managed to reach the floor. Marit pressed her face close to the base of the north wall and felt the steady push of outside air. The wall was not broken. The sill was not cracked. The wind was simply stronger than the house. It moved across 1,000 miles of flat, open prairie with nothing to slow it, struck the cabin, and compressed under the wall like water forced under a dam. The house was not a shelter. It was an obstacle that the wind went around, over, and under. She lay on the floor and thought about her father. Halvor Tveit had been a tenant farmer near Telemark. He kept sheep on mountain pastures in summer and brought them down before the first hard frost. When Marit was 8, he had taken her to a stone fence that crossed a meadow hollow below the farmstead. It was September. Frost had come early. Her father crouched beside the wall and took Marit's hand. He lowered it slowly until her palm was inches above the grass in the hollow. The air was sharp and wet, cold enough to sting. Then he raised her hand to the top of the wall. Warmer. He raised it higher. Warmer still. Cold has weight, her father said. He scraped frost from the bottom of the hollow with his thumbnail. It settles where the ground invites it. Give it a lower road, and it will take it. Marit had filed that memory the way a child files anything told by a parent, without understanding, without context, just the feeling of her father's rough hand around her wrist and the iron smell of frost on grass and the sound of sheep bells muffled in the valley fog. Now, lying on the floor of a cabin in Dakota Territory with wind pushing under the wall, the memory returned with the force of something that had been waiting 26 years to be useful. Cold has weight. It settles where the ground invites it. Give it a lower road, and it will take it. The wind was not just blowing against her cabin. It was pressing cold air down and under the sill because that was the lowest path available. The prairie was flat. The cabin sat on flat ground. There was nowhere for the dense, cold air to go except through the gaps at the base of the walls. But what if the ground around the cabin was not flat? What if there was a lower path, a trench, a cut, a depression in the earth that gave the wind somewhere to spend its force before it reached the walls? What if the cold air, which settles like water, found a channel below the level of the sill and pooled there instead of pushing through? She did not design the spiral that night. She did not design anything. She went outside before dawn with a shovel and dug a shallow cut along the north wall, 2 feet deep, 20 feet long, a ditch in the frozen crust of the prairie that took her 40 minutes to hack out of soil that was already beginning to harden. The next morning, she checked the cut. Loose, wind-driven snow had drifted into the trench overnight. The ground along the base of the north wall was cleaner than she had seen it in a week. The snow was in the ditch, not packed against the sill. She went inside. She lit a candle stub and set it on the floor near the north wall. The flame leaned, but it did not gutter the way it had the night before. The air was still cold at floor level, but the steady pushing current, the underground river of wind that had been pumping through the seam, was weaker. One shallow ditch, 20 feet long, and the difference was visible in a candle flame. Marit sat on the floor and thought about what would happen if the ditch were deeper, wider, if it circled the cabin instead of running along one wall, if berms of packed earth rose on either side to force the wind up and over instead of straight and under, if the whole design spiraled outward so that the wind had to cross one trench, then a berm, then another trench, then another berm, spending its force in layers before it ever reached the sill. The logic was simple enough that a child could follow it, and complicated enough that no one she knew had done it. If the wind drives low across the prairie, you cannot stop the sky, but you can make the wind trip before it reaches the door. If dense cold air settles into low places the way water runs downhill, you can give it a path that leads away from the cabin instead of under it. If snow drifts wherever wind slows down, you can make the drift form in a trench instead of against your walls. She sketched the design in the dirt floor with a nail, a continuous spiral trench beginning at the northwest corner. The windward side saw it circle in the cabin 3 times, each ring separated by a berm of packed earth. The trench 5 feet deep at the deepest windward cuts, 4 feet wide at the bottom, 6 to 7 feet across at the top to prevent collapse. The berms 3 to 4 feet high, faced with saved sod to hold their shape. A shallow drain notch leading toward the lower slough to the southeast so meltwater could not flood the cabin in spring. 3 rings, roughly 450 feet of trench, hundreds of cubic feet of earth to be moved, packed, and faced, with 1 woman, 1 draft mare, and a broken iron scraper, before the ground froze solid. Beret Haugen came on a Thursday, carrying a jar of buttermilk and a look of careful concern. Beret was 41, a neighboring farm wife with 5 children, a husband named Torsten, who worked the land with the grim efficiency of a man who expected nothing from the world except more work, and the kind of practical intelligence that sorted every human action into 2 categories, useful and wasteful. She was not unkind. She was Norwegian. She expressed affection through labor and worry through directness. She found Marit in the yard, driving stakes into the ground in a curve that made no sense from any angle Beret could find. "What are you marking?" Beret asked. "A trench," Marit said. Beret looked at the stakes. They curved away from the north wall in a widening arc, each one tied with a strip of rag. The line did not follow the cabin. It circled it. "A trench," Beret repeated. "Around the house." 3 rings, Marit said, "with berms between." Beret set the buttermilk on the chopping block. She looked at the stakes again. She looked at Marit's hands, which were cracked across the knuckles from gripping the shovel in cold air. She looked at the test ditch along the north wall, still holding its cargo of drifted snow. "Marit," Beret said, and her voice carried the particular weight of a woman who has buried 2 children and does not waste words on things that are not serious. "You need food. You need wood. You need someone to mend that single tree before Brindle tears a shoulder. You are measuring a circle." Marit did not argue. She walked to the test ditch and pulled a twist of dry hay from her apron pocket. She lit the hay with a match, knelt, and held the smoking twist at the rim of the cut. The smoke did not rise straight. It bent into the ditch and lay along the bottom like fog in a valley. Then she held the twist at the same height beside the cabin wall. The smoke climbed and scattered. "The wind goes where the ground invites it," Marit said. If I give it a lower road, it takes the road instead of going under my wall. Beret watched the smoke. She understood what she was seeing. She was too intelligent not to. But understanding the principle and believing the practice were different things, and Beret's face showed the gap between them. One ditch, 20 feet long, I can see, Beret said. 3 rings around a house, 5 feet deep before the ground freezes. That is not a plan. That is a prayer. It is all I have, Marit said. Beret picked up the buttermilk. She did not offer to help. She did not tell Marit to stop. She said, Torsten says green willow will clog your pipe inside a week. And she walked back across the dead grass toward her own quarter section, where 4 sod walls and 8 cords of dry oak kept her family alive through December, without requiring anyone to dig a maze around the house. Marit watched her go. Then she picked up the shovel and began cutting the first line of the outer ring. The town heard before the first ring was half complete. Boys riding the township road saw the stakes from a quarter-mile away. White rag strips fluttering on sticks in a widening spiral around a sod cabin looked strange enough to be worth reporting. By the following Saturday, the story had reached Blunt's store, and Cassian Blunt did what Cassian Blunt always did with information about struggling homesteaders. He turned it into entertainment. The store was the social center of the settlement. Men gathered around the iron stove on cold mornings to swap weather reports, complain about grain prices, and measure themselves against their neighbors' misfortunes. Blunt encouraged this because men who lingered bought things, and men who gossiped created debts of social obligation that Blunt could convert into financial obligation when the time came. Marit Brecke is digging a grave for her own house and calling it wisdom, Blunt said. Someone laughed. Someone else said the spiral looked like a pig pen designed by a drunk surveyor. A man named Hollis, who hauled freight and owed Blunt for axle grease, said he had seen the stakes from the road and thought someone was laying out a cemetery. The mockery mattered because it was not just words. On the Dakota prairie, survival depended on networks of exchange. A farmer lent his neighbor a team for plowing and received help with harvest in return. A woman brought buttermilk to a widow and received mending in return. These exchanges were not charity. They were the economy of people who could not survive alone. And when the community decided that someone was foolish, the exchanges dried up. No one lent labor to a fool, because labor spent on foolishness was labor stolen from survival. Within a week, Marit felt the consequences. The blacksmith, who had been willing to discuss repairing the cracked scraper handle on terms, told her he needed payment in advance. A teamster who sometimes hauled split wood for barter said he was too busy before freeze-up. Beret's husband, Torsten, told Beret not to go back to the Brecke claim because helping a woman dig a ditch around her cabin made the Haugen family look foolish by association. Cassian Blunt watched all of this and said nothing more in public. He did not need to. The community was doing his work. Every neighbor who withdrew help brought Marit one step closer to the moment when she would have to sell, and Blunt would be standing there with his ledger and his $60 offer. But he added one quiet move. He told customers that if Marit's trenches ruined the natural drainage around her cabin, spring melt would rot the sill timbers, and the claim would be worthless before she could prove up. He said it as observation, not threat. He said it the way a man says something he has already calculated the profit on. Marit heard about the store talk from Beret, who came back once more despite Torsten's warning, carrying nothing this time except news and the expression of a woman torn between loyalty and sense. They are laughing, Marit, Beret said. Blunt is telling people your claim will be ruined. Blunt wants my claim, Marit said. Yes, Beret said, and you are making it easy for him. Marie drove the scraper blade into the frozen ground, levered a slab of earth loose and dragged it to the berm line. Her shoulder burned where the scraper handles had bruised the muscle 2 days before. Her palms were split across the heel of each hand. The hem of her skirt was frozen stiff with clay. She had skipped the midday meal so Eli could have the last of the cornmeal mush. "I'm making it necessary for him," Marit said. The first mechanical failure came on a clear morning in the third week of November. Marit had hitched Brindle to the slip scraper and was cutting the outer ring's deepest section, where the trench needed to reach 4 feet to catch the worst of the windward flow. The iron blade bit into soil that was half frozen, hard as green oak beneath the surface crust. Brindle leaned into the harness. The single tree, the wooden crossbar that connected the harness traces to the scraper chain, had been repaired twice with wire since John's death. It was not strong enough for what Marit was asking. The blade caught on a root. Brindle lunged. The single tree cracked lengthwise, and the sudden release of tension threw the mare sideways. Brindle's front legs tangled in the loose chain. She went down on one knee in the trench, and when she scrambled up, blood ran from a cut above the right fetlock where the chain link had gouged through hide. Marit dropped the scraper handles and went to the mare. Brindle stood shaking, holding the right foreleg off the ground, blood bright on the pale hair above the hoof. The cut was not deep, but it was in the worst place, the fetlock joint, where every step flexed the wound open. Marit pressed a rag against the cut and felt the mare's pulse hammering through the thin skin. Brindle was 20 years old. She was the only draft animal on the claim. Without her, the scraper was a piece of iron lying in a ditch, and the ditch would stay at whatever depth it had reached when the single tree broke. Marit looked at the trench. The outer ring was perhaps 1/3 complete. 120 feet dug, maybe 270 to go. The second ring had not been started. The third ring existed only as stakes in the ground. The ground was freezing deeper every night. She had, at best, 3 weeks before the soil became too hard to cut with a horse-drawn scraper. She had a bleeding horse, a broken single tree, a blacksmith who wanted cash she did not have, and a community that was waiting for her to fail. Eli appeared at the cabin door, holding the cracked blue cup she carried everywhere since John's death. She looked at the mare. She looked at her mother kneeling in a half-dug trench with blood on her hands. "Is Brindle going to die?" Eli asked. "No," Marit said. She did not know if that was true. She wrapped the fetlock with a strip torn from her second petticoat, led Brindle to the lean-to, and stood in the November wind looking at a broken scraper, a stained trench, and roughly 300 feet of earth that still needed to be moved before the ground turned to iron. The temperature dropped 4 degrees that night. By morning, the top inch of soil in the unfinished trench had frozen hard enough to ring when she struck it with the shovel blade. The clock was not ticking. It was closing. Marit splinted the single tree with a strip of oak from the cabin's one spare board and bound it with wire until the crossbar held enough tension to drag the scraper through unfrozen soil. It would not survive another root. She knew that. She hitched Brindle anyway, wrapping the mare's fetlock in a double layer of rag and checking the bandage after every pass. The outer ring grew by 10 feet a day, then 8, then 6, as the frost line sank deeper and the blade bounced off soil that had turned to something closer to stone than earth. Marit learned to read the ground by color. Dark soil still cut. Gray soil resisted. White soil, where frost crystals laced the surface, would not yield to anything short of a pick, and she did not own a pick. She worked from first light until the sun dropped below the western edge of the prairie, which in late November meant fewer than 10 hours. Eli fed the stove. Eli heated water for the mare. Eli carried the candle to the test ditch each morning and reported whether the flame leaned or stood. These reports became the only measure of whether the work was accomplishing anything at all. By the end of the third week in November, the outer ring was complete. 120 feet of trench, 3 feet deep at the shallowest point, 4 feet at the windward northwest arc. The berm on the cabin side rose 2 feet, a ragged wall of loose earth that the first real wind would shave flat. It was not enough. Marit knew it was not enough. The berms needed sod facing to hold their shape. The second ring needed to be deeper than the first, and the drain notch toward the slough had not been started. She stood at the edge of the outer trench and counted days. It was November 23rd. Hard freeze could come any night. The ground was closing like a fist, 1 inch per day, and once it locked, no horse and no scraper would open it again. That evening, she found a man squatting beside her half-dug second ring, moving one of her stakes. Kittel Vangen was 62 years old. He was thin in the way that old men who have worked outdoors their entire lives are thin, not from hunger, but from decades of burning everything the body could spare. His hands were oversized for his frame, scarred across the knuckles, and he moved them with the careful precision of someone who had learned that tools do exactly what hands tell them, nothing more and nothing less. He had moved Marit's stake 6 inches downslope. Marit saw him from 30 yards away and came fast, carrying the shovel across her body like a weapon. She did not know him. Strange men on a widow's claim in November were not welcome. She stopped 10 feet away and held the shovel where he could see it. "You moved my stake," Marit said. Kittel did not stand. He was crouching with his weight on his heels, one hand resting on the moved stake, the other tracing the dirt with his finger. He looked up at her with eyes that were the color of river ice and carried about as much warmth. "If you leave it where it was," Kittel said, "spring water will come back under your bed." Marit looked at the stake. She looked at the ground. The original position was level with the cabin's southeast corner. The new position was 6 inches lower, angled toward the slough. "The water needs a road," Kittel said. "Same as the cold. You are building roads for the wind, but you have forgotten the melt." "Who are you?" Marit asked. "Kittel Vangen. I cut grade for the railroad at Brookings. Before that, I cut ditches for the territorial road crews. Before that, I drained fields in Hallingdal for a man who paid me in potatoes." He stood up slowly, one hand on his knee. "I have been watching you stake this for 3 days. You measure before you dig. That is why I am talking to you instead of walking past." Marit did not lower the shovel. "What do you want?" "Nothing you have," Kittel said. "I want to see whether you know what you're doing, or whether you're just digging because you're frightened." "I am frightened," Marit said, "and I know what I am doing." Kittel almost smiled. It did not reach his mouth, but something shifted behind the ice-colored eyes. He pointed at the outer ring. "Your first trench is cut well enough. Your berm is going to wash flat in the first hard blow because you have not faced it. Your grade falls wrong in 2 places. Your drain notch is not started, and without it you will have a moat full of ice by March." He paused. "But the line is true, and you are cutting to grade, and you stake the windward deep section where it belongs. Who taught you to watch where cold gathers?" "My father," Marit said. "He watched sheep frost in Telemark." Kittel nodded once, as if this answered a question he had been carrying. "Then your father knew more than Alpheus Rowe." He walked to the outer berm and pressed his boot against the loose earth. It crumbled. He crouched again and pulled a clump of prairie sod from the edge of the trench, a thick mat of roots and soil that held together like woven cloth. "Root side out," Kittel said, pressing the sod against the berm face. "The roots grip the dirt behind them. Rain runs off the grass side. You face the berm like you are building a sod wall on its side. He looked up at Marit. You know sod walls. I know sod walls, Marit said. Then you know this. You just have not done it yet. He did not offer to help. He did not say he would return. He pressed the sod into the berm, stood, and walked toward the township road with the stiff, careful gait of a man whose lungs did not give him as much air as his legs wanted. Marit watched him go. Then she knelt where he had knelt and pressed her own hands against the loose berm. The earth was cold and crumbling. She pulled a sod clump from the trench edge, turned it root side out, and pushed it against the face. It held. The roots gripped the packed dirt behind them like fingers locking together. Kittle came back the next morning. He brought a borrowed Fresno scraper, wider and heavier than Marit's slip scraper, with a curved steel blade that could shave a layer of earth in one pass and deposit it where the teamster wanted it. The Fresno had been invented 4 years earlier for moving soil on California canal projects, but Kittle had used one on the Brookings Railroad grade and knew how to set the blade pitch for different soils. This is not charity, Kittle said, unhitching the scraper from the back of a neighbor's wagon. This is an old man who wants to see if a spiral trench can stop a Dakota wind. If it works, I will have learned something before I die. If it does not work, I will have wasted a week, and I have weeks to waste. He did not have weeks to waste. Marit would learn that later. The first teaching happened in the second ring's windward cut. Kittle hitched Brindle to the borrowed Fresno and showed Marit how the blade pitch determined everything. Shorten the chain 2 lengths, Kittle said. The lip skims instead of dives. If the blade goes too deep, the mare cannot pull it. If it stays too shallow, you're scratching, not cutting. He put his hand on Brindle's shoulder. Watch her. The blade tells you through the horse. If she lunges, you're cutting greed. If she walks steady, you're cutting honest. Marit shortened the chain. Brindle leaned forward. The blade peeled a 6-inch layer of frozen topsoil and rolled it into the scraper's curve, like a wave curling over itself. The earth came up in a clean sheet, and Brindle walked steady. Honest, Kittle said. They worked the second ring together for 3 days. Kittle did not do the heavy pulling. His chest would not allow it, but he set every grade line, corrected every berm angle, and caught 2 drainage errors that would have turned the inner trench into a pond. The second teaching came on the 4th day, when they began packing the berms. Loose earth catches snow, Kittle said. Good, but loose earth also slumps when it freezes and thaws. The berm falls apart, the snow goes where it wants, and your rings become ditches full of mud. He showed Marit how to lay sod blocks root side outward against the berm face and stamped them in place with her boot. The roots locked into the packed earth behind them. The grass side shed water. The berm became a low wall of living sod rather than a pile of dirt. Sod houses stand for 20 years because the roots hold, Kittle said. A berm is just a sod wall lying on its back. They faced 40 feet of berm that afternoon. Marit's hands bled from pulling sod. Kittle's breathing came in shallow, hitching draws that he tried to hide by timing his exhales to the rhythm of the stamping. He was not hiding it well. The third teaching came when Kittle poured a dipper of water into the half-finished second trench and made Marit watch where it stalled. Water and cold both punish pride, Kittle said. If you think your grade is right but the water stops, the water is right and you are wrong. The water pooled at a low spot 15 feet from the drain notch. Kittle had Marit shave 1 inch of earth from the bottom of the trench between the pool and the notch. She poured again. The water moved. Not fast, but it moved, a thin sheet creeping toward the slough. The spiral must fall just enough to drain. Kittle said, but not enough to become a chute aimed at the door. If you slope too much toward the cabin, you have built a funnel for meltwater and wind both. If you slope too little, ice dams in the trench and snow bridges across the top, and the rings become a wall that traps everything against the house instead of pulling it away. He showed her the balance point by eye. He had spent decades reading grade on railroad beds and road cuts, where a quarter-inch of error per 100 feet turned a drainage ditch into a flood channel. Marit did not have his eye, but she had his dipper, and she poured water into every section of trench until she could see the direction of flow without pouring at all. Progress came in numbers, and numbers were the only thing that kept the fear at a distance. First ring, complete. 120 feet, 3 to 4 feet deep, berm faced with sod on the cabin side. Second ring, staked and half cut. 170 feet planned, 4 to 5 feet deep at the windward arc. Kittle's Fresno made the cutting faster, but the frost line was winning. Every morning, the top 2 inches of soil had to be broken with a pick before the scraper could work. Berm height, 3 feet on the first 2 sections, rising toward 4, where Kittle said the northwest wind would hit hardest. Wood remaining, 1 1/4 cords. Marit had burned half a cord in November alone, and the worst cold had not come. Cash remaining, $8.10. She had spent $5.30 on flour, a pound of nails, and a length of rope. Days until hard freeze, unknown. Frost now stayed in the shaded trench cuts past noon. The topsoil froze 6 inches deep overnight and only thawed in the upper 3 inches by mid-afternoon. They were cutting in a window that narrowed every day. Setbacks accumulated like interest on debt. An early snow hid the grade stakes for 2 days, and Marit restaked the third ring's line by memory, which Kittle corrected by 3 inches at the southeast turn. Brindle's shoulder swelled from the uneven pull of the patched singletree, and Kittle rigged a breast collar from rope and canvas to distribute the load. A trench wall slumped after a night of sleet, burying 20 feet of the second ring's windward section under a slide of wet earth that had to be scooped out by hand before it froze in place. Eli developed a cough that rattled in her chest at night. Marit listened to it through the wall of the curtained sleeping area and counted the jars of preserves remaining. 8. Eli needed broth, and there was no meat except the salt pork, which was down to 4 pounds. Cassian Blunt sent word through a freighter that if Marit ruined the drainage on her quarter section, the claim would be worth less than the note she owed. The freighter delivered this message while watching Kittle reset a grade line and Marit haul earth from the third ring's first cut. The freighter did not offer to help. He did not even step down from the wagon. Then Blunt made a sharper move. He visited the blacksmith and suggested that extending credit to someone engaged in destroying her own property was poor business. The blacksmith, who owed Blunt for iron stock, sent word to Marit that the scraper shoe would not be repaired unless she paid $2 in advance. The scraper shoe was the iron plate that protected the blade edge from stone. Without it, the blade would chip and dull within a week. Marit paid the $2. She now had $6.10. Kittle said nothing about Blunt. He said nothing about money. He came each morning, checked the grade, corrected what needed correcting, and worked until his breathing turned to a sound like paper tearing. Then he sat on the inner berm and watched Marit work and told her what she was doing wrong from 20 feet away. Their disagreement came on the 5th day of the third ring. Marit wanted to cut the third ring shallower, 3 feet instead of 4, to save time and spare Brindle. The ground was nearly locked. Every foot of depth cost twice the labor it had cost a week earlier. 3 feet would still catch wind-blown snow and provide some buffer. Kittle said no. 3 feet, and the wind walks over it in January. You have built 2 good rings. If the third is weak, the wind finds the weakness, and all 3 fail. Brindle cannot pull through frozen ground at 4 feet, Marit said. Her shoulder is swelling. The single tree will not survive another hard root. Then cut narrower, Kittle said. 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide at the bottom instead of 4. The wind does not care about width. It cares about depth. Give it the depth. They argued in the trench for 10 minutes, which was the longest conversation Marit had heard Kittle sustain without stopping for breath. He won because he was right, and because Marit had learned enough from the first 2 rings to recognize when someone who had spent 40 years reading grade was telling her something that mattered. She narrowed the 3rd ring to 3 feet at the bottom. She kept the depth at 4. Brindle pulled slower, and the single tree creaked with every pass, but it held. Unexpected help came after dark on a night in early December. Beret Haugen appeared at the edge of the outer trench with her oldest son, a boy of 15 named Peter, and a coil of rope. She carried a covered crock and the expression of a woman who had told her husband she was returning a dish and walked 2 miles in the dark to do something she could not explain to herself. I brought back the crock, Beret said. You did not lend me a crock, Marit said. Then I brought one you will need. Beret set the crock on the berm. It was full of rendered tallow for waterproofing leather and greasing harness joints. She looked at the trenches in the starlight, 3 rings of black earth around a small cabin, the berms rising like low walls, the stakes casting thin shadows. It looks like a labyrinth, Beret said. It looks like survival, Marit said. Beret did not say she believed. She did not say the trench would work. She said, a bad idea still needs straight rope. And she handed Peter the coil and told him to help Marit reset the grade stakes on the 3rd ring's south turn, where the line had drifted during the sleet. They worked for an hour. Beret held the lantern. Peter drove stakes. Marit pulled the rope taut between markers and checked the fall with Kittle's method, pouring water and watching where it stalled. When they finished, Beret collected Peter and walked back across the frozen grass without saying goodbye. Marit stood in the dark and listened to their footsteps fade. She was not alone. She had never been entirely alone. But the distance between not alone and supported was measured in miles she could not cross by asking. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been doubted by someone who could not understand what you were building? The next morning, Marit saw Kittle fold a handkerchief into his coat pocket and press it flat, the way a man does when he wants the shape to disappear. She saw the edge of the cloth. It was not white, it was pink, shading to rust at the center. Old lungs, Kittle said before she could ask. Railroad grading dust and winter damp. It is nothing that has not been there for years. He picked up the grade level, 2 glass vials set in a wooden frame, the railroad surveyor's most basic instrument, and walked to the 3rd ring's drain notch as if the conversation had not happened. His steps were steady. His breathing was not. Marit did not press him. She had learned that Kittle answered questions about the earth with patience and questions about himself with silence. She watched him set the level across the notch, sight the bubble, and shave a 1/4 inch from the left bank with 3 strokes of a hand trowel. The water would drain. The notch would carry meltwater toward the slough. The old man's hands knew their work, but the handkerchief was not old lungs and winter damp. Marit knew blood when she saw blood. She had washed enough of it from John's hand in those last 9 days. She said nothing. She pulled the scraper handles up and called to Brindle. The mare leaned into the harness. The blade bit into the last section of the 3rd ring's windward arc. Earth peeled up in a frozen curl. The trench deepened by 6 inches. 1 more day, maybe 2. Then the ground would close for good. By the third week of December, the spiral was complete enough to be visible from the township road and visible enough to frighten people. 3 rings of raw earth surrounded the cabin like the walls of a fortress built by someone who did not know what a fortress looked like. The berms rose 3 to 4 feet, faced with sod that was already freezing into the packed earth behind it. The trenches dropped 4 to 5 feet at the deepest windward cuts, narrowing to 3 feet at the bottom where the frozen clay walls held their shape in the cold. Plank bridges crossed the gaps at the cabin door and at the lean-to entrance so Marit and Eli could walk to the well and the privy without climbing in and out of ditches. From inside the inner ring, the cabin looked the same as it always had, small, underbuilt, newspaper-lined. From outside the outer ring, the cabin had disappeared behind earthworks. Children from neighboring claims dared each other to run the spiral. Men riding past slowed their horses and stared. The word that came back to Marit through Beret was that the Brecca place looked like a burial site, or a military position, or a mad woman's garden. Then a north wind came, and the first observable result appeared. It was not a blizzard. It was a ground blizzard, wind lifting old snow off the prairie and driving it sideways in sheets, though no new snow was falling. The air above waist height was clear. The air below waist height was white. Snow moved across the flat land like water running over a table, fast and low and relentless. Marit watched from the cabin door. The snow hit the outer berm and rose. Not over, the berm was not tall enough to stop it entirely, but up, forced upward by the packed sod face, and in that upward motion it lost speed. The snow that did not clear the berm spilled into the outer trench and settled. Dense, cold air, heavier than the warmer air above it, sank into the cut and pooled there like water filling a channel. The second berm caught what the first missed. More snow piled in the second trench. The inner ring, the one closest to the cabin, received the least wind-driven snow of all 3. The sill of the north wall, which had been packed with drift after every previous wind, was rimed but not buried. Marit made measurements with what she had. She set a candle stub on the floor near the north wall. The flame leaned slightly, but held. Before the trenches, that candle would have guttered flat or blown out entirely during a ground blizzard. She checked the water pail near the door. The surface had frozen at the rim, but the center was still liquid. Before the trenches, the pail froze solid during any sustained wind. She burned 1 armload less wood that night than she had burned during a comparable blow in November. 1 armload. It was not proof. It was a suggestion, but it was a suggestion that could be measured, and measurement was the only language that would eventually silence the men at Blunt Stove. Alpheus Rowe came the following day. He walked the outer ring without speaking, climbed down into the trench at the windward arc, and stood in 5 feet of packed snow that had drifted into the cut instead of packing against the cabin wall. He looked at the snow for a long time. "A small wind proves nothing," Rose said when he climbed out. "January will step over that toy like a man stepping over a boot jack." Kittle, who was sitting on the inner berm mending a harness strap, said nothing. He did not need to. The snow in the trench said it for him. But Kittle also warned Marit that the trench could fail in ways she had not yet considered. If snow bridged across the top of the outer ring, wind might skim over the bridge and hit the second berm with full force. If a wall collapsed under the weight of packed drift, the trench would fill with debris and lose its depth. If the drain notch clogged with ice, meltwater would back up and freeze inside the rings, turning the buffer zone into a solid mass pressed against the cabin. He taught her one more thing. He called it cutting wind teeth. At 2 points on the outer berm, the northwest corner and the north face, he had Marit carve staggered notches into the berm top, not gaps, notches. each one offset from the one behind it so that wind entering a notch hit a solid berm face 6 feet further along. The wind lost speed navigating the stagger. Snow dropped into the notch. The direct path to the cabin was never open. A straight wall sends the wind up and over, Kittle said. Teeth make the wind chew before it swallows. Cassian Blunt came on a strangely warm morning in the second week of January. The warmth was wrong. Marit knew it. Kittle knew it. Anyone who had survived more than 2 Dakota winters knew it. A January thaw on the northern plains was not a gift. It was a lure. Warm air from the southwest pushed in. Temperatures climbed above freezing. Snow softened and dripped from eaves, and people opened their doors and breathed air that did not hurt. Children went outside without coats. Farmers walked to barns without ropes. The world pretended that winter was relenting. It was not relenting. Behind the warm front, moving southeast across Montana and the western Dakotas, a mass of Arctic air was falling like a wall. When the warm air lifted and the cold air dropped, the temperature could fall 40 degrees in less than an hour, and the cold arrived with wind. Blunt did not know this, or he did not care. He drove his wagon to Marit's cabin on the warm morning, carrying a piece of paper and the confidence of a man who believed time had done his negotiating for him. Last offer before spring assessment, Blunt said. He stood in the mud between the outer and second berms, his boots sinking in the softened earth, his coat open because the air was mild. $65 for the quarter section. I have added 5 for the improvements. He looked at the trenches and smiled thinly. Such as they are. Marit was on the cabin roof, clearing a sod patch where snowmelt had begun seeping through. Eli was inside. Kittle had come that morning to check the drain notch and was kneeling at the southeast outlet with a trowel, clearing debris. The claim is not for sale, Marit said from the roof. Mrs. Brecka, Blunt said, you owe me $48. You have spent the winter digging ditches instead of cutting wood. You have less fuel than you started with. Your mare is lame, your child is sick, and you have... He consulted the paper. $6.10 in cash. How do you know what I have? Marit asked. Blunt did not answer that. He folded the paper and put it in his vest. The offer stands until the thaw ends. After that, the note speaks. He climbed into his wagon and drove east. The wheels cut ruts in the soft mud. Chickens that had wandered out in the warmth scattered from the horse's path. Kittle stood up from the drain notch and watched the wagon go. He said, That man knows the weather is about to turn. How do you know? Marit asked. Kittle pointed northwest. The sky along the horizon had changed color. It was not gray. It was not blue. It was the color of lead held over a candle, a dull, metallic yellow that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. When the sky looks like that, Kittle said, the wind is already moving. We have hours, maybe less. The temperature began to fall at noon. By 1 o'clock, the dripping from the eaves had stopped. By 2 o'clock, the mud in the trenches had crusted over. By 3 o'clock, Eli, who had been sent to fetch water from the well inside the inner ring, came back to the door and said she could not see the barn from the well. The wind had begun. What struck Kingsbury County on the afternoon of January 12, 1888, was not a blizzard that built slowly and gave warning. It was a wall of cold air that fell out of the northwest like something solid, pushing ahead of it every loose crystal of snow on the open prairie. The temperature dropped from above freezing to below zero in less than 2 hours. The wind did not rise gradually. It arrived fully formed, a sustained force that turned the air white and made the world disappear. People called it the children's blizzard because it struck in the early afternoon when children were in schoolhouses or walking home, when farmers were between house and barn, when the warm morning had convinced everyone that the day was safe. Across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota, between 200 and 300 people died, many of them caught in the open by a storm that gave no time to reach shelter. Marit heard it before she saw it, a sound like canvas tearing, far away and then close, and then the north wall of the cabin shuddered as if something had struck it with a shoulder. The stovepipe rang. The newspaper on the walls fluttered. Eli grabbed the cracked blue cup and pulled it to her chest. Kittle was still outside. He had been at the drain notch when the sky changed and had moved to the outer berm to check the wind teeth. Marit opened the door into a blast of air that pushed her backward. She could see the inner berm. She could not see beyond it. The world past the second ring was white. "Kittle!" she shouted. He appeared at the plank bridge over the inner trench, walking with one hand on the rope guide Marit had strung between the berm and the cabin door. His face was white above the collar. He came through the door and sat on the bench and breathed in long, slow pulls that sounded like something inside him was grinding. "The outer trench is filling," Kittle said. "That is what it is supposed to do, but if the snow bridges the top, the wind will skip straight to the second berm." Marit fed the stove. She had 3/4 of a cord stacked inside the cabin against the south wall, all she had moved indoors before the ground froze. She fed it in small pieces, not because she was rationing, but because the stove drew better with small fuel, and she needed every unit of heat the wood could give. The first hour passed. The outer trench filled with wind-driven snow exactly as Kittle had predicted. The snow compacted into the cut, and the berm above it took the brunt of the wind. The second trench caught the overspill. The inner ring, closest to the cabin, remained partially open, a low channel of relatively still air between the final berm and the cabin wall. Marit checked the candle on the floor beside the north wall. The flame leaned. It did not gutter. The wind was not pumping through the floor seam with the same force that had moved the flour sack in November. Then Beret Haugen hit the outer berm like a woman thrown from a horse. Marit heard the impact through the cabin wall, a thump, and then a voice calling a name that the wind tore to pieces. She opened the door. Beret was in the inner trench, crawling, one cheek gray with frost, snow packed into her collar and sleeves. She had followed fence wire from her farm to the township road and then lost the road when the wire ended. "Ansel," Beret said. "Ansel is not home." Ansel Haugen was 9 years old, Beret's youngest, and he had been at the schoolhouse 2 miles east when the storm hit. The schoolhouse had a stove and a teacher and walls, but the question was whether Ansel had stayed inside or tried to walk home in the first minutes of the blow, when the warm morning still made the distance seem manageable. Marit pulled Beret inside. Beret's hands were white at the fingertips. Her right ear was hard and colorless. Marit pressed warm cloth against the ear, and Beret screamed once, then went silent, which was worse. "I have to find him," Beret said. "You cannot see the well from the door," Marit said. "You will not find the schoolhouse." "He is 9 years old," Beret said, and her voice was the voice of a woman for whom arithmetic had stopped working. The second complication came from the lean-to. Brindle had been inside the 3-sided shelter when the wind struck, but a plank on the north face tore loose and the wind found the gap. The mare panicked. Marit heard the hammering of hooves against the sod wall and the scream a horse makes when it is trapped and terrified. If Brindle broke through the lean-to wall, the mare would run blind into the whiteout and die. If the lean-to collapsed with Brindle inside, the wreckage could block the gap between the second and third berms that allowed the trench system to drain. Marit tied rope around her waist. She had learned this from Kittle, Never go outside in a blow without rope fixed to the cabin. She gave one end to Beret and said, "Do not let go." She crawled out the door and along the inner berm to the lean-to. The wind was a physical object. It did not blow against her. It leaned on her, constant and heavy, as if the entire sky were tilting sideways. Snow filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She breathed through her collar and tasted wool and ice. She found the lean-to by touch. The loose plank was banging in a rhythm set by the gusts. Brindle was stamping inside, her hooves cracking on frozen ground. Marit pulled the plank back into place and braced it with the scraper, wedging the iron handle between the plank and the sod wall. The banging stopped. Brindle's hooves slowed. Then she heard a sound that was not wind and was not hoarse. A thin, high sound coming from somewhere beyond the second berm. Not a word. A cry. The kind of sound a child makes when he has been crying for so long that the crying has worn down to a single note, repeated without hope of answer. Marit pressed her face against the inner berm and listened. The cry came again. It was outside the second ring, somewhere in the space between the second and outer trenches. Downwind. The wind had carried it to her because the berms had channeled the sound along the trench instead of scattering it across the open prairie. "Ansel," Marit said. Not a shout. She did not have breath to shout. She said it to the berm, to the trench, to the boy she could not see. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether Marit's strange maze is shelter or grave. Marit followed the inner trench. Not across open ground. Along the trench curve, one hand on the berm face, counting the turns by touch. The trench was her navigation path, the one thing in the whiteout that had a shape she knew. She had dug every foot of it. She knew where the sod facing ended and the raw earth began. She knew where the plank bridge crossed at the northeast turn. She knew where the gap between the second and inner berms narrowed at the southeast. She found the gap and climbed into the second trench. The wind hit harder here. The outer berm was full of snow and no longer catching the full force of the blast. The second trench was open, and the wind raked across it in sheets of ice crystal. Marit crawled. The rope paid out behind her, its tension the only connection between her body and the cabin where Beret held the other end. The cry came again, closer. Marit reached out and touched cloth. Ansel Haugen was wedged against the face of the second berm at the point where the windward arc met the northeast turn. The wind had pushed him there the way it pushed snow, into the lowest, most sheltered pocket it could find. He was below the worst of the blast. The berm rose above him and broke the wind over his head. He was not safe. His mittens were gone. His hands were white. His face was glazed with ice. But he was in the trench, not on open ground, and the trench had done what Marit had built it to do. It had caught him before the prairie could swallow him whole. Marit pulled the boy against her chest. He was rigid with cold, but he was breathing. She dragged him along the second trench to the gap, through the gap to the inner trench, and along the inner trench to the plank bridge by the cabin door. She counted the turns with frozen hands. Left turn at the northeast, straight along the north face, right turn at the plank bridge. The rope drew taut, and Beret pulled from the other side, and Ansel came through the door like a caught fish hauled from dark water. Kittel had not moved from the bench. He could not move. His breathing had become a sound that filled the cabin, a wet, rhythmic labor that rose and fell with the wind outside, as if his lungs were connected to the storm. But his eyes were open, and when Marit came through the door with the boy, Kittel said one thing: "The drain notch." Marit stopped. She was soaked, half frozen, her hands too numb to feel whether she still held the rope. "What?" The drain notch at the southeast, Kittle said. The wind is packing snow into it. If it clogs, spindrift backs up in the second ring and packs against the inner berm. Then the inner ring fills, and you lose the buffer. He was right. Even in the state he was in, even with his lungs making sounds that belonged in a hospital rather than a sod cabin, his mind was still reading the trench system the way he had read railroad grades for 40 years. He knew where the weakness was because he had built the drain, and he knew what the wind would do to it because he had spent a lifetime watching what wind and water did to everything men built. "Cut the low tooth," Kittle said. "By the willow stake. I showed you." The low tooth. A relief notch Kittle had cut into the inner berm near the drain outlet 3 weeks earlier. If the main drain clogged, the relief notch would allow packed snow to slump away from the inner ring into the lower ground toward the slough. Marit had stamped sod over it to keep it clear. Now she needed to open it. She went back out. The storm was worse. The whiteout was total. She found the inner trench by falling into it and followed the berm face south by touch, counting sod blocks until she reached the willow stake Kittle had driven at the drain outlet. She dug with the shovel, chopping at wind-packed snow until she found the relief notch beneath it. She cleared the notch, widening it with the shovel blade, and the packed snow in the second ring southeast section shifted and slumped through the opening, away from the inner berm down toward the slough. The pressure eased, not dramatically, not as a visible event, but the inner ring did not fill. The buffer held. Marit crawled back to the cabin. She closed the door. The stove was burning low but steady. She fed it 3 sticks of cottonwood and watched the flame take hold. The wind continued through the night. The temperature fell to 20 below zero, then lower. The stove could not heat the cabin. It could only prevent the cabin from reaching the temperature outside. The floor was cold. The walls were cold. The newspaper fluttered. But the candle by the north wall baseboard burned upright, its flame steady enough to read by because the wind was not coming through the floor seam with the force it would have brought without 3 rings of earth between the prairie and the sill. Across the township, the storm did what storms do to the unprepared. Alpheus Rowe's nephew tried to walk between barn and house, 60 feet of open ground, and lost direction in the whiteout. He was found the next morning with frostbitten feet that would cost him 3 toes. A neighbor's cow smothered when wind-packed drift sealed the barn door shut, and the animal suffocated in the airless space. A bachelor claim holder 3 miles north left his cabin to retrieve fuel from an outside stack and never found his way back. His body was recovered in a creek bed 200 yards from his door. Inside Merritt's cabin, Beret held Ansel against her body under every blanket they could pile. Eli slept in the narrow space between the stove and the south wall, wrapped in John's old coat. Kittle breathed. Marit fed the stove. She did not use less wood than she would have without the trenches. She could not measure that in the middle of a blizzard. What she knew was that the stove did not have to be run red hot just to keep the air breathable. The fire burned at a pace that would not crack the firebox, would not overheat the pipe, would not send creosote blazing inside the chimney. The wind was not pumping through the floor. The drift was not packing under the sill. The house was cold, but it was cold the way a house in a Dakota winter is supposed to be cold. From the season, not from the wind turning every crack into a bellows. The storm died at dawn, not gradually. The wind stopped as if someone had closed a door. The silence was so sudden that Merritt thought she had gone deaf. She opened the cabin door and looked out at a world scoured white and perfectly still. The outer trench was filled level with snow, packed so hard it would hold a person's weight. The berms were glazed with ice, smooth and glinting in the early light. The second trench was half full. The inner ring was open. The cabin sat in a hollow of quiet air, surrounded by walls of white, and the sun was coming up over a prairie that looked like it had never moved. Eli came to the door and stood beside her mother. She held the cracked blue cup. "Is it over?" Eli asked. Marit looked at the outer trench, filled solid with the snow that would have been packed against her walls. She looked at the inner ring, still clear enough to walk. She looked at the cabin, standing. "This part is," Marit said. The proof was in the snow, and the snow did not lie. By mid-morning on January 13, the wind had been still for 4 hours and the temperature had settled at 11 below zero. Cold, but the kind of cold that a stove and 4 walls could manage. Marit cleared the plank bridges, checked Brindle's fetlock and shoulder, and fed Eli the last of the salt pork boiled in water with a handful of dried turnip. Ansel Haugen sat by the stove with his hands wrapped in rags, his fingers red and swollen but still attached. Beret sat beside him and said nothing. Kittel slept on the bench with his coat over his chest, his breathing shallow but steady. Then Alpheus Rowe came. He arrived on foot because the drifts on the township road were too deep for a wagon. He wore a buffalo coat that reached his knees and a fur cap pulled down to his eyebrows, and he walked with the stiff, deliberate stride of a man who had spent the night feeding a stove and measuring the storm's damage against everything he thought he knew about winter. He did not come to the cabin door. He went to the outer trench first. Marit watched from the doorway as Rowe climbed down into the outer ring. The trench was filled level with compacted snow, packed so hard that his boots barely dented the surface. He walked along the bottom, or rather, the top, since the snow had filled it completely, and stopped at the windward arc where the trench had been deepest. He crouched. He pressed his bare hand against the snow and held it there. Then he climbed out and walked to the second trench, half full. The snow here was looser, wind-dropped rather than wind-packed. He walked through it, kicking at the surface, watching how it broke. He climbed out and walked to the inner ring, nearly clear, a thin crust of frost along the bottom, but the trench was open. The sod-faced berm on the cabin side was intact, glazed with ice but not damaged. He walked to the cabin's north wall. The sill was rimed with frost, not buried, not packed with drift. The gap under the sill that had been Marit's original enemy, the gap that had moved a flour sack in November, was visible because nothing had blocked it from the outside. The wall was clean. Rose stood there for a long time. He took off one mitten and pressed his bare fingers against the sill timber, then against the packed snow in the outer trench 20 feet away. He was measuring the difference. The sill was cold but dry. The outer trench was cold and buried. Everything that should have been against the cabin wall was in the trench instead. Marit came outside and stood on the plank bridge. She did not speak. She had learned from Kittel that silence after a demonstration was more powerful than any argument. Rowe looked at her. His face worked through something, not anger, not shame, but the particular discomfort of a man whose experience has been publicly insufficient. He had survived 20 Dakota winters. He knew sod walls and shelter belts and fuel mathematics. He had told Marit to sell. He had told her that her ditches were a bootjack that January would step over. "I told you windbreak stood up," Rose said. His voice was flat. "I was wrong. You laid one down and made the prairie climb it." He pulled his mitten back on and looked at the 3 rings of earth and snow surrounding the cabin. He was seeing it now, not as a madwoman's ditch, but as a system, each ring catching what the previous ring missed, the berms forcing wind upward, the trenches collecting the cold, dense air that would otherwise have been pressed under the sill. He was seeing it the way Kittel had designed it, and Marit had dug it, and the storm had tested it. "How deep is the windward cut?" Roe asked. 5 feet, Marit said. "And the berms?" 3 to 4, sod-faced, root side out. Roe nodded slowly. "The schoolhouse road drifts shut every blow. 3 families could not reach the school last week." He paused. "Could you set something along that road? Not a full ring, just the windward side." "I could," Marit said. Roe put his hat back on. "I will bring a team and a scraper," he said, "when the ground thaws." He walked away across the white prairie, and Marit understood that something had shifted that could not shift back. Beret's conversion did not come in words. It came in linen. 2 days after the storm, Beret returned to Marit's cabin carrying a bundle of clean cloth, sheets and bandage strips, and a length of good cotton that had been saved for summer sewing. She set the bundle on the table and looked at Ansel, who was sitting by the stove with his hands in a basin of cool water, flexing his fingers the way Marit had shown him to keep the blood moving. "His hands are going to be all right," Marit said. Beret nodded. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried where others could see, but her jaw was tight and her eyes moved between Ansel's hands and the cabin wall and the door beyond which the trenches lay, and something in her expression resolved itself the way a knot resolves when the right strand is pulled. "Show me where to dig mine," Beret said. Marit did not make Beret ask twice. She took her outside and walked the inner ring, explaining what each section did. This berm catches the first wind. This trench collects the snow that spills over. This notch drains meltwater so the ice does not build up and press against the cabin. Beret listened the way she did everything, with total attention and no wasted motion. "I cannot dig 3 rings," Beret said. "Torsten will not spare the team for a full spiral." "You do not need 3, Marit said. "You need the windward crescent, 1 trench, 4 feet deep, running along the northwest face of your house with a berm on the house side. It will not catch everything, but it will catch the worst of it." Beret looked at the ground. She was calculating labor, time, soil depth, and the likelihood that Torsten would allow it. Then she said, "I will need rope for the berm stakes, and I will need you to check my grade." "Come tomorrow," Marit said. "Bring Peter." Beret picked up the empty basin from the table and walked to the door. She stopped and turned back. She did not say thank you for saving my son. She said, "You were right about the smoke." She meant the candle test in November, when Marit had shown her how smoke lay down in the test trench. Beret had understood then. She had not believed. Now she believed, and the distance between understanding and belief had been measured by her youngest son's frozen hands. They came in 1s and 2s over the following week, appearing at the edge of the outer trench with the particular combination of curiosity and reluctance that people bring to a thing they mocked a month ago and now need to understand. A man named Stensland, who homesteaded a mile south, came with his wife and asked how far from the wall the inner ring should sit. Marit told him 8 to 10 feet, enough to allow the cold air room to settle before it reached the sill. Stensland said his cabin faced northeast instead of northwest, and asked whether the crescent should follow the wind or the wall. Marit said follow the wind. "The wall does not matter. The wind matters." An older couple named Flaten came and asked how deep before the wall slumps. Kittel, who was sitting on the berm wrapping his hands in rags because the cold made his fingers ache, answered that question. 4 feet was safe in firm prairie soil. 5 feet needed sod facing, or the freeze-thaw cycle would collapse the wall by March. He said it without standing up, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had dug more linear feet of ditch than anyone in the township. A young husband named Lunde came alone and asked whether 2 families could share a berm line between adjacent houses. Marit walked the ground with him and showed him where the prevailing wind would push snow. If the houses were close enough, a shared berm could protect both, but the trench between them needed to drain downslope or the meltwater would flood whichever house sat lower. She poured water from a dipper onto the frozen ground and let Lunde watch where it ran. Kittle's teaching method passed forward. Marit did not charge. She did not keep the knowledge. She walked people's claims, checked their grade, corrected their stake lines, and explained the logic in the same plain language her father had used beside a Norwegian stone wall 30 years earlier. Cold has weight. Give it a lower road. The wind goes where the ground invites it. She taught specifics. How much sod must be saved for facing? At least 2 inches of root mat, cut in blocks the size of a bread loaf, and pressed root side out. How the drain knot should angle away from the cabin toward the lowest ground. How rope paths between house, barn, well, and privy should be tied with knots that could be read by frozen hands in whiteout. 1 knot for the house, 2 for the barn, 3 for the well. How wind teeth in the berm top broke straight airflow without opening a direct channel to the cabin. She taught by demonstration, not lecture. She poured coffee from a tin cup into a trench section and let the visitor watch where it pooled. She shook flour across a board and held a strip of raised dough against the flow to show how a berm redirected the wind. She lit candle stubs at the base of the cabin wall and at the top of the berm and let the difference in flame behavior tell the story. Kittle watched these teaching sessions from the inner berm, where he spent most of his hours now, too tired to dig, but too stubborn to stop. He corrected Marit twice, once on a drain angle, once on a berm height recommendation, and each time she accepted the correction without argument, which told the visitors more about the relationship than any explanation could have. Cassian Blunt's first reaction was denial wrapped in accusation. He came to the store the week after the blizzard and told the men at the stove that Marit Brecka had been lucky. The storm had simply spared her corner of the township. Wind was unpredictable. One farm could be buried while the next was barely touched. The trenches had nothing to do with it. But the men at the stove had information Blunt could not control. Rowe had walked the trenches and measured the drift pattern. Beret had been inside the cabin during the worst of the blow and had watched the candle flame hold steady. Ansel was alive because the trench had caught him below the wind line. 3 families had seen the evidence with their own eyes, and evidence was harder to dismiss than theory. Hollis, the freighter who had laughed about the drunk surveyor's pig pen, said he had driven past the Brecka place the day after the storm and noticed that the cabin's north wall was clean while every other structure on the road was drift-packed to the eaves. He did not say Marit was right. He said, "That is a strange thing to see. But a strange thing that people have seen is stronger than a certainty they have only been told." Blunt shifted ground. If the trenches had helped, and he was not admitting they had also damaged the land. The claim was scarred. The drainage was disrupted. Spring melt would rot the sill and turn the quarter section into a bog. He said this as prediction, not threat, but the men at the stove heard the calculation beneath it. Blunt still wanted the claim, and if the trenches could not be dismissed as foolishness, they could perhaps be framed as damage. For now, Blunt waited. He had the note. He had the terms. Spring would come, and with spring would come payment or forfeiture. The trenches might stop the wind, but they could not stop arithmetic. The relationship between Marit and Kittle deepened through January and February in the way that relationships deepen between people who work together on something that matters and do not waste time on things that do not. Kittle came most mornings. On good days, he checked the trenches, cleared the drain notch, and sat on the inner berm giving instructions while Marit shoveled or restacked a section of berm that had settled overnight. On bad days, he sat inside by the stove and talked about grade. He told Marit about the railroad. The Brookings grade had been cut through prairie gumbo, heavy clay that swelled when wet and cracked when dry. The crew had been mostly Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who worked for $1 a day and slept in tents that froze to the ground in November. Kittle had been the grade boss, responsible for reading the land, setting the cut lines, and making sure the roadbed drained. He had not been the strongest man on the crew. He had been the most careful. Strength digs the ditch, Kittle said. Care makes the water go where it should. Anyone can dig. Not everyone can read where the land wants the water to go. He told Marit about his sons who had both gone to Minnesota to work in the flour mills because they did not have the patience for grade work. He said this without bitterness, but with a specific kind of loneliness that Marit recognized because she carried a version of it herself, the loneliness of someone whose knowledge has no inheritor. He gave Marit his grading level and the 2 glass vials set in a wooden frame that had been his primary instrument for 4 decades. He set it on the table one morning in February and pushed it toward her across the rough wood. "This is not charity," Kittle said. "You use it straighter than my sons ever did." Marit picked up the level and sighted along it. The bubble sat centered between the marks. She could feel the balance of the instrument, the way the wood was seasoned, the way the vials were set at precisely the angle needed to read a grade of 1 inch per 100 feet. It was the kind of tool that carried the knowledge of its owner in its weight. "I will bring it back when I am done," Marit said. "Keep it," Kittle said. "I have read my last grade." They disagreed once, sharply, in the second week of February. Marit wanted to deepen the second ring's southeast section because she had noticed that the prevailing wind shifted slightly eastward during late winter storms. Kittle said the shift was seasonal and temporary, and that deepening the southeast would weaken the berm wall on that side, which was already thinner than the windward faces. "You are chasing the wind," Kittle said. "The wind moves. The trench does not. Build for the average, not the exception." "The exception is what kills people," Marit said. "The exception is also what exhausts the builder," Kittle said. "You have a child to feed and a claim to keep. You cannot dig forever." It was the first time he had spoken to her as if she were his student rather than his partner. Marit heard the distinction and did not like it. She said, "I did not ask to be told when to stop." Kittle looked at her for a long moment. His expression held something that was not anger and was not pride, but sat between the two. The recognition that the person he had taught had become someone who no longer needed permission. "No," Kittle said, "you did not." He did not apologize. He did not concede the point. But the next morning, when Marit checked the southeast section, she found that Kittle had come before dawn and shaved a test line along the berm base, a 6-inch cut that would show whether the wall could hold at reduced thickness. He had compromised without surrendering. It was the most respect he knew how to give. Kittle died on a night in early March at Beret Haugen's house, where he had gone to mark a grade line for Beret's Crescent Trench. He had been weaker since mid-February. His walks to Marit's cabin had slowed from 30 minutes to an hour. He stopped correcting her grade because she no longer needed correction, and he stopped checking the drain notch because she maintained it better than he could have. He sat on the inner berm in the late winter sun, wrapped in a coat that hung loose on his frame, and watched the meltwater trickle toward the slough through the notch he had designed. "It drains," Kittle said, on what turned out to be his last afternoon at the Breka claim. "That is all a man can ask of his work." He died in his sleep. Beret found him in the morning, still on his side, his hands folded inside his coat the way he always slept, protecting his fingers from the cold even in a heated room. The cough had stopped. Everything had stopped. He looked, Beret said later, like a man who had put down a tool and decided not to pick it up again. Marit did not go to the body. She went to the inner berm and sat where Kittle had sat and looked at the meltwater running through the drain notch in thin silver threads. The trenches were softening. The packed snow in the outer ring was settling, leaving a crust of ice over a hollow that would collapse as the thaw deepened. The berms held their shape because the sod facing gripped the earth, but the raw surfaces between the sod blocks were starting to crumble. The old man's work was visible in everything. The grade of the drain, the pitch of the berm faces, the staggered wind teeth on the northwest arc, the 6-inch test line along the southeast berm that had shown Marit the wall could hold, the level on the cabin table, the handkerchief he had never let her see clearly, folded flat in his pocket, stained with the rust-colored evidence of a body that had been failing since before he moved her first stake. Marit placed the grading level on the cabin table beside the window, where the light hit it in the morning. Outside, the trenches that people had laughed at carried the first meltwater away in silver threads toward the Slav, running the road the old man had given them. His last lesson did not speak, but it moved. The secondary crisis came from water, not wind. Spring thaw in Dakota Territory was not gentle. It came fast, sometimes in a single week, and it turned everything the winter had frozen into a river that went wherever gravity and terrain invited it. Snow melted from the surface down. Ice in the trenches cracked and shifted. Meltwater pooled in every low spot, and low spots were exactly what Marit had spent the winter creating. The first sign of trouble was water standing in the second ring's southeast section, the same section Marit and Kittle had argued about. Meltwater from the outer trench was not draining fast enough through the notch. Ice had formed a dam in the channel, and the water was backing up into the second ring. Marit cleared the notch with a shovel, and the water moved, but by the next morning it had dammed again. The freeze-thaw cycle was working against her. Water ran during the warm hours, froze in the channel during the cold hours, and built a thicker dam each night. The drain notch that Kittel had designed for steady flow was not meant for the pulse and freeze pattern of a Dakota spring. Then Cassian Blunt did something that transformed the drainage problem from manageable to dangerous. The township road ran along the north edge of Marit's quarter section, and a shallow drainage cut crossed under the road at the lowest point. This cut had been there before the trenches. It was a natural swale that carried meltwater from the higher ground west of the road toward the slough east of Marit's cabin. During the winter, snow had packed into the cut and sealed it. Now, with the thaw, the cut should have been carrying meltwater east as it always had. Instead, the cut was full of ash and refuse, stove cleanings, broken crates, spoiled feed. A winter's worth of waste dumped into the drainage channel at the point where it crossed near Blunt's storage shed, which sat on a quarter-acre lot beside the road. Blunt had used the natural swale as a dump because it was convenient, and because he had calculated that the spring melt would wash the debris east, away from his property. But the debris dammed the channel. Meltwater from the high ground backed up behind the dam, ponded in the road, and began cutting a new path. That new path ran south, toward the schoolhouse, and toward Marit's outer trench, which was already struggling with its own meltwater. Bray saw it first. She came to Marit's cabin on a morning when the road was ankle-deep in standing water and said, "Blunt's garbage is sending the runoff toward the school." Marit walked the road with Beret and Rowe, who had come because the standing water was damaging his road grade. They found the block drainage cut and traced the new water path southward. The schoolhouse sat in a slight depression, not enough to notice in summer, but enough to collect every drop of redirected meltwater. The schoolhouse cellar was already damp. If the blockage held through the main thaw, the cellar would flood, the sod foundation would soften, and the building could settle or collapse. Rose said, "Someone has to clear that cut." Blunt said, "The cut is on my lease. I will clear it when I choose." "You will clear it now," Marit said, "or the school floods." She said it in front of Rowe, Beret, Stensland, and four other adults who had come to see why the road was underwater. She said it not as a request, but as a fact, the way Kittle would have said it, with the flat authority of someone who reads where water goes and does not have time for the opinion of someone who does not. Blunt's face tightened. He looked at the people standing on his section of road and saw something he had not expected to see. They were looking at Marit, not at him. They were waiting for her direction, not his. "You have no authority over my property," Blunt said. "I have no authority over your property," Marit agreed. "But water does." She did not wait for his permission. She could not. The school was at risk, and Kittle was dead, and the water was rising. She remembered Kittle's dipper lesson: water and cold punish pride. She remembered his voice saying the spiral must fall just enough to drain. She looked at the ponded water, the blocked cut, the new path carving southward, and she saw the solution the way Kittle would have seen it, not as a single fix, but as a system adjustment. "Do not clear the main cut first," Marit said to Rowe. "If we open it now, the backed up water rushes through in one surge and undercuts the road on the other side. We need 2 relief channels first, one on each side of the road, angled away from the school. Open those, let the water spread and slow, then clear the main cut." Rowe looked at the ground. He looked at the water. He looked at Marit. He had been reading roads for 20 years, and what she had described was exactly what a road engineer would have ordered. "Where do you want the channels?" Rowe asked. Marit marked the lines with stakes. Rowe brought his team and scraper. They cut 2 shallow relief channels in the softened spring earth, angled to spread the meltwater across the flat ground north and south of the road, away from the school's depression. The ponded water began to move, spreading into a thin sheet that soaked into the thawing ground instead of cutting a channel toward the building. Then Merritt directed Rowe to clear the main drainage cut, and the backed-up water drained east toward the slough at a rate the channel could handle. The schoolhouse was not damaged. The road held. The standing water disappeared within a day. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm arrives. Cassian Blunt stood beside his storage shed and watched Marit direct Rowe's team across the drainage cut he had blocked. He watched the water obey her lines. He watched the men follow her stakes. He did not help. He did not interfere. But his expression carried the look of a man doing arithmetic on a ledger that no longer balanced in his favor. The note was still due. $48. Spring was here. The terms had not changed, but the woman who owed the money was no longer the widow with 2 cords of green wood and a child's cough who had stood in this cabin in November while Blunt offered her $60 and a boarding house in Huron. The woman who owed the money was the one the township road overseer had just obeyed in public. Blunt walked back to his wagon and drove east without speaking to anyone, but he did not present the note. Not that day. Not that week. Something in the equation had shifted, and Blunt was a man who did not act until his arithmetic was certain. By the second week of April, the trenches had softened into something that no longer looked like earthworks. The packed snow in the outer ring had collapsed, leaving a rough channel of mud and dead grass. The berms had settled an inch or two, their sod faces still intact, but their raw crowns rounded by melt and wind. The drain notch ran steadily, a thread of brown water curling toward the slough. The whole system looked less like a fortress and more like what it was, a set of deliberate scars in the prairie, already beginning to heal. But the scars had done their work, and people remembered. Stensland came back in April with his wife and a borrowed team. He wanted a windward crescent along his cabin's northwest face, and he wanted Marit to check the grade before he cut. Marit walked his ground, poured water from a dipper at 3 points along the proposed line, and moved 2 of his stakes before she was satisfied. She showed his wife how to cut sod blocks for the berm face. 9, a good 4 arms length, root mat at least 2 inches thick, pressed root side out and stamped firm. The roots are the wall, Marit said. The dirt is just what the roots hold together. Stensland's wife, a quiet woman named Ragna, who rarely spoke in front of neighbors, asked whether the crescent would protect the root cellar on the east side. Marit said no, the crescent protected against the prevailing northwest wind, and the root cellar faced the wrong direction. But she showed Ragna how to pile brush along the east wall of the cellar entrance to create a smaller wind trap that would keep drift from blocking the door. The Flattens came in late April. They were older, mid-60s, no children at home, not enough strength between them to dig a full trench. Marit adapted. She designed a shallow windward berm, 18 inches high, faced with sod and backed by a single row of willow brush cut from the slough. The brush was flexible. It caught snow the way a comb catches hair, trapping the drift in the gaps between the branches, while the berm below redirected the ground-level wind. It was not as effective as a full trench. It was possible for 2 people in their 60s to build, and possible was what mattered. Lunde and his neighbor built a shared berm line between their cabins, angled to the northwest, with a common trench that drained between the 2 properties toward a low spot Marit had identified with the grading level. They cut the trench in 2 days using a borrowed Fresno and a team of 4 horses, which was more power than Marit had used for her entire 3-ring spiral. The trench was rougher than hers. The berm was uneven, but it was in the ground, and when a late April blow pushed loose snow across the prairie, the snow piled in the trench instead of packing against the cabin walls. Marit taught the rope path system to every family that would listen. 1 knot for the house, 2 for the barn, 3 for the well. She had Beret's children practice walking the rope blindfolded in daylight, feeling the knots with their fingers, counting turns. Peter Haugen, who was 15 and possessed the confidence of a boy who had helped reset grade stakes in the dark, taught younger children in the schoolyard until the teacher Frassai, a woman from Vermont who had survived the January storm by locking the schoolhouse door and burning the last of the coal, asked Marit to come and explain the system to the older students. Marit stood in the schoolhouse and talked to 12 children about wind and cold and the weight of air. She did not use Kittle's words. She used her own. She poured water on the schoolhouse floor and let the children watch it find the lowest crack between the boards. She said, "Cold does the same thing. It finds the lowest place. If you give it a lower place to go, it goes there instead of where you live." She lit a candle and held it near the floor, then near the ceiling, and said, "Where does the flame lean?" The children said the floor. Marit said, "That is where the wind lives when the storm comes, below your knees, below the sill, below the bed where your sister sleeps." She did not mention Kittle by name, but everything she said was Kittle's teaching, translated through her hands and her voice, and when a boy asked who had taught her about cold air, she said, "A man who cut grades for the railroad and read the ground better than anyone I have known." Rowe incorporated Marit's layout principles into the township road maintenance. He had 3 snow traps cut along the school road, shallow crescents on the windward side, angled to catch drift before it could pack across the travel lane. They were crude compared to Marit's spiral, but they work the same way. Give the snow a lower, wider place to settle, and it settles there instead of on the road. The school road stayed passable during two late season blows that would have closed it in previous years. Beret became the best teacher of sod facing in the township for the reason that Beret was good at everything she decided to do and was blunt enough to correct anyone who did it wrong. She told Stensland's wife that her sod blocks were too thin. She told Lunde that his berm angles were sloppy. She told her own husband, Torsten, that his crescent trench was a foot too shallow on the windward end, and when Torsten said it was deep enough, Beret poured water into the trench, watched it pool at the wrong spot, and said, "The water says you're wrong." Torsten deepened the trench. Marit refused Cassian Blunt's offer to sell the trench designs through his store. Blunt came to her in early May with a proposal. He would stock printed instructions, sell them for 25 cents each, and give Marit a nickel per copy. He framed it as partnership. Marit heard it as control. If Blunt owned the distribution, he could claim credit, inflate the price, or discontinue the instructions at his convenience. The knowledge that had kept her daughter alive and caught Beret's son in a trench instead of open prairie was not a commodity for a man who had tried to buy her claim for $60. "The method is free," Marit said. "Walk any trench on any claim and you will learn what you need to know." Blunt smiled the smile of a man who has been refused a business proposition and is already calculating the next approach. He said, "Free things have no value, Mrs. Brecka." "This one does," Marit said. "That is why it is free." Cassian Blunt's reckoning did not come from Marit. It came from the weather, which did not care about ledgers. The following winter, 1888 into 1889, arrived earlier and harder than the year before. The first serious blow came in late November, a 2-day ground blizzard that packed snow against every surface the wind could reach. It was not as violent as the January storm. It did not kill anyone, but it tested every structure in the township, and the structures told the truth about who had prepared and who had not. Blunt's supply shed sat on a quarter-acre lot beside the township road, between his store and the grain warehouse. The shed held kerosene tins, flour barrels, salt, seed stock for spring, and the small hardware, nails, hinges, axe heads, saw blades, that homesteaders needed and could not make. The shed was well built by prairie standards, frame walls, plank floor, a good roof, but it sat on flat ground with no earthwork around it because Blunt had told anyone who asked that merchandise did not need a woman's ditch. The November blow packed snow against the north and west walls of the shed in a drift that rose to the eaves. Wind-driven powder found the gap under the sill, the same gap that had been Marit's original enemy, the same gap that existed under every building on the prairie that did not have something to break the wind before it reached the wall. The powder came through in a fine, constant stream and settled on everything inside. Blunt found the damage the morning after the blow. Kerosene tins had been coated with a crust of icebound snow that had seeped under their lids. 2 tins had cracked when the kerosene expanded during the freeze. Flour barrels near the north wall were damp through the staves. The flour inside clumped into hard lumps that could not be sold. Salt had absorbed moisture and fused into a solid block. Seed stock in burlap sacks along the west wall was wet enough to sprout if it thawed, which would make it useless for spring planting. Blunt lost more in one night than Marit owed him. He did not come to her immediately. He spent a week inventorying the damage, arguing with the freighter about replacement costs, and calculating the loss against his ledger. The numbers were not complicated. The damaged goods were worth roughly $200 at retail. Replacement cost, including freight, was closer to $170. Blunt's margins were tight enough that $170 was not an inconvenience. It was a wound. He came to Marit's cabin in the first week of December. He did not bring the ledger. He did not bring the note. He brought his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had practiced several opening sentences on the drive over and found all of them insufficient. "I need a trench around the shed," Blunt said. Marit was inside, patching Eli's coat with a piece of canvas. She set the needle down and looked at him. Blunt stood in the doorway, filling it, his coat powdered with road dust, and his face carrying the particular tension of a man who's about to pay a price he has spent a year trying to avoid. "A crescent or a full ring?" Marit asked. "Whatever stops it," Blunt said. "A windward crescent will catch most of it. Your shed faces northwest. The drift packed against that wall because nothing broke the wind before it reached the sill." "Then a crescent," Blunt said. He paused. "Name your price." Marit looked at him. She thought about the November night when he had sat at this table and told her a widow could sign land away same as any man. She thought about the January morning when he had offered $65 for a quarter section worth $300. She thought about the drainage cut he had blocked with refuse, sending meltwater toward the schoolhouse. She thought about Cuddle, who had been too tired to stand on the last day she saw him at the berm, whose grading level sat on the table between her and Blunt. "You already named it," Marit said. $48. Blunt's jaw moved. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise, because he was too careful for surprise, but recognition. He had spent a year trying to buy a claim with a debt. Now the debt was buying him a trench. "The note," Blunt said. "Cancel the note," Marit said. "I will mark and supervise a proper windward crescent around the shed. You supply the labor and the team." "That is not a fair trade," Blunt said. "The trench work is worth $20. The note is $48. "The note was for seed wheat and flour and nails," Marit said. "My husband signed it. My husband is dead. You held it over me for a year. You tried to buy my land with it. You cut off my credit with the blacksmith using it. The note is worth whatever I say it is worth because you need the trench, and I do not need your approval." Blunt looked at the grading level on the table. He looked at the patched coat in Marit's hands. He looked at the trenches visible through the window, the 3 rings that he had mocked, that the township had mocked, that the winter had validated and the spring had proven, and the community had adopted. He looked at a woman who owed him $48 and was sitting across the table from him as if she owned the bank. "Agreed," Blunt said. "In front of witnesses," Marit said. "Rowe and Beret. The note canceled on paper, not on your word." Blunt's mouth thinned, but he nodded. The following Saturday, Marit stood beside Blunt's supply shed with Rowe on one side, Beret on the other, and Stensland watching from the road. Blunt produced the note from his vest pocket, wrote "canceled" across the face in ink, and signed beneath it. Rowe witnessed. Beret witnessed. Marit folded the paper and put it in her coat. Then she picked up the grading level and walked the northwest face of the shed. She poured water from a dipper at 4 points. She set 3 stakes. She told Blunt's hired man where to cut and how deep and at what angle to face the berm. The crescent was dug in a day and a half with a fresh team and a good Fresno. Marit checked every foot of grade. She corrected the berm angle twice. She showed Blunt's man how to face the sod root side out and stamp it tight. She did not rush. She did not punish Blunt by doing careless work. The trench around his shed was as true as any section of her own spiral, because the method was Kittle's, and Kittle's work did not bend to accommodate grudges. When it was done, Blunt stood at the edge of the crescent and looked at the clean grade line and the sod-faced berm. He did not thank Marit. He said, "It is a good line." "Yes," Marit said, "it is." Arne Solheim arrived in the township in the spring of 1889, driving a wagon loaded with woodworking tools and the components of a portable forge. He was a widower, 38 years old, with hands that were missing the tip of the left ring finger from a chisel accident, and a way of looking at objects wheels, runners, joints, braces, as if he were reading a language written in wood grain. He had come to set up as a wagon maker and repairman, and the first thing he asked the settlement for was not customers, but information. He wanted to know whose scraper blades needed resetting, whose single trees were cracked, and whose sled runners were warped from a winter of hard use. He found his answers at Blunt's store, which was where everyone found everything, and the answers led him to Marit's cabin because Marit's slip scraper had a blade that had been resharpened so many times the edge was concave. He drove to the Brecka claim on a May morning and stopped his wagon at the outer trench. He did not get down immediately. He sat on the wagon seat and looked at the 3 rings of earth around the cabin, softened by spring, grass already creeping across the berm faces, the trench's shallow green depressions rather than raw cuts. He looked at the plank bridges. He looked at the rope lines still strung between cabin, barn, well, and privy. Then he got down and walked the outer ring, stepping carefully along the berm top, looking at the grade and the drainage notch and the sod facing with the focused attention of a man who builds things and respects the evidence of building in others. Marit came out of the cabin carrying the broken scraper blade. She had expected a smith, not a man walking her berms. "Your bridges need bracing," Arna said before she could speak. "The one at the door has a sag in the center plank. It will crack under a snow load." Marit looked at the bridge. He was right. The center plank had bowed over the winter, and she had been meaning to replace it but had not found the lumber. "I came about the scraper," Marit said. "I can see the scraper," Arna said. "I can also see the bridge. The bridge is the more urgent problem because the scraper will not kill you, but a broken plank over a 5-foot trench in a blizzard might." He said this without arrogance. He said it the way Kittle would have said it, as a reading of physical reality that did not require social pleasantry to be heard. Marit handed him the scraper blade. He turned it in his hands, running his thumb along the concave edge, checking the tang where it met the handle socket. He said the blade could be reforged, but the steel was tired and would not hold a hard edge. He could make a new blade from wagon tire iron, which was tougher, and set it with a wider face that would shave earth instead of digging it. He said this would take 2 days and cost $1.50, or he would trade it for permission to study her trench layout and copy the design onto paper so he could explain it to customers who asked about earthwork. "People ask you about earthwork," Marit said. "People ask me about everything," Arna said. "I am the new man. They want to know what I think about their claims, their equipment, their wives' cooking. Last week, Stensland asked me whether I thought his crescent trench was deep enough. I said I did not know because I had never seen one. He said, 'Go to the Brecka place. She built the original.'" Marit looked at this man who had walked her berms before he had introduced himself, who had noticed her bridge before he had noticed her scraper, and who was now standing in her yard offering a fair trade in a voice that carried respect for her measurements before it carried anything else. "I will show you the layout," Marit said. "You do not need to trade for it." "I would rather trade," Arna said. "Then we are even, and I can come back without owing you anything." He came back the following week with the new scraper blade. He set it in the handle and adjusted the angle while Marit watched. Then he asked whether she wanted the bridge repaired. She said yes. He measured the span, cut lumber from his wagon stock, and built a new bridge with cross bracing that distributed the load across the full width of the trench. He worked for 3 hours and did not ask for payment. When Marit pointed out that she had not agreed to charity, Arna said, "The bridge is not charity. It is an apology for the one I will build at the lean-to, which I intend to charge you for." He built the second bridge the following week. He charged her 50 cents and stayed for dinner. Their courtship happened through shared work across the spring and summer of 1889. Arna built safer plank bridges across all 3 trench crossings, designed a hinged section that could be lifted for cleaning the inner trench,
and constructed a rope guide post system that held the whiteout navigation lines taut instead of letting them sag and tangle in wind. Marit taught him why straight paths failed in drifting snow. The wind packed straight channels into solid corridors of drift, while curved paths broke the wind's momentum and stayed clearer. Arnie listened the way he looked at wood grain, with total attention and no interruption. He asked to court her in August, after he had taken instruction from her in front of Rowe, Stensland, and Lund on where to place a windbreak berm for a new homesteader's barn. He did not ask in private, because private would have implied that the asking was separate from the work, and the work was where everything between them had been built. "I would like to call on you properly," Arne said, standing beside a fresh berm line with mud on his boots and sawdust in his collar. "You have been calling on me since May," Marit said. "I have been repairing your bridges since May," Arne said. "That is not the same thing." Marit looked at him. He was not handsome in the way that stories require men to be handsome. He was missing part of a finger. His shoulders were uneven from years of leaning over a workbench, but he had walked her berms before he had spoken to her, and he had noticed the bridge before the scraper, and he had asked to learn her method before he had asked to learn her name. "Call properly," Marit said. Marit and Arne married quietly in the autumn of 1891 in the settlement church that had been built the previous year from lumber freighted from the railhead. Eli stood beside her mother holding the cracked blue cup, which she had not put down since John's death and would not put down until she left for the normal school in Brookings at 16. The years that followed compressed the way years do when the crisis is past and the living is in the daily work. Marit and Arne added a room to the cabin in 1892. Framed walls with proper double chinking, sod insulation on the north and west faces, and a new stove that drew better and burned cleaner. The trenches softened into green swales, their outlines visible only in winter when the snow filled the old cuts and left the berm ridges bare. New cottonwood and ash seedlings, planted in the spring of 1890, grew along the line where the outer berm had stood, their roots fed by the rich soil Marit had turned. In 10 years, they would be a living windbreak standing where the earthen one had been, roots replacing sod, canopy replacing berm, shade replacing trench. Marit's homestead became a winter preparation stop in the township. Families brought teams in October to cut windward crescents on new claims, and Marit checked every grade line with Cattell's level. She never taught without the level in her hand. It was not superstition, it was continuity. The glass vials reading true because the man who set them had known what true looked like, and the woman who carried them had learned to see it the same way. Arne built a rack of wooden demonstration models, cross-sections of berm and trench, cut from pine, that Marit used to show new arrivals how the system worked before they walked their own ground. The models sat on a shelf in the cabin beside the grading level and the cracked blue cup, a row of objects that told the story of the household without a word. Eli grew into a girl who walked rope lines in whiteout without counting knots because she had memorized the distance between each one. She taught younger children the system at school and corrected their knot spacing with a severity that came directly from Berit Haugen, who had taught Eli sod-facing technique the way she taught everything, by doing it right and expecting others to match her. Eli became a teacher at 19 and kept a rope line between the schoolhouse and the coal shed for the rest of her career. Berit remained Marit's closest ally and fiercest critic. When new settlers tried to cut corners on berm facing, Berit walked their claims and told them the sod was too thin, the grade was wrong, and the drain would clog by March. She said these things with the authority of a woman whose son had been saved by a trench she had not believed in, and no one argued with her because no one could. Rowe used Marit's principles for 2 decades of township road work, snow fences along school roads, drainage cuts angled to carry melt away from intersections, berm lines at exposed homesteads where the wind crossed open ground. He never designed a system without consulting Marit, and he never acknowledged this publicly, because Rowe was a man whose pride operated on a delay. He could accept being wrong in private a full year before he could admit it in public. The method spread the way most useful things spread on the frontier, not through patents or newspaper articles or printed instructions, but through the slow accumulation of example. A family dug a crescent. Their neighbor saw the drift pattern after a blow and dug one of their own. A man traveled to the next township and described what he had seen. The description was imprecise. The execution was rougher, but the principle survived the translation because the principle was simple. Give the wind a lower road, and it takes the road instead of going through your walls. Marit did not seek credit. She did not need it. The credit lived in the trenches themselves, in the grade lines that ran true, in the sod facing that held through freeze and thaw, in the drain notches that carried meltwater to the slough instead of under the cabin. Kittle's name was not on any of it. Marit's name was not on any of it. The work was on the land, and the land remembered what people forgot. By the mid-1890s, no one near Marit Breca's section called the earth rings a maze. They called them winter cuts. Not every family dug a spiral. Most did not have the labor, but a dozen farms within riding distance had learned the smaller lessons. Break the wind before it reaches the sill. Trap drift where it cannot bury a door. Mark rope paths before the whiteout. Give meltwater a road away from the house. 2 of those farms had survived blows that would have cost them stock or lumber or worse, and the families who lived on them did not need anyone to explain why the cuts were there. Marit lived out her life on the same quarter section she had nearly been pressured to sell for $60 and a boarding house room in Huron. She and Arnie raised 2 more children after Eli. The cabin grew. The grove thickened. The first trench softened into a low green swale that filled with wild flowers in June and snow in December, and in winter the old curve still caught drift before it reached the cabin wall, because the grade Kittle had set ran true even after the man who set it was 20 years in the ground. On the morning after the great blow of January 1888, Cassian Blunt had stood in his store and told the men at the stove that Marit Breca was digging a grave for her own house and calling it wisdom. The grave he mocked was full of snow, but the house was not. The wind had spent itself in the rings. The child inside was breathing. The stove was still alive. And beneath the door, where the prairie had once pushed its cold fingers through the floor and moved a hanging flour sack in the dark, the candle flame stood straight.